I have stood through 100 ceremonies and never once watched a man. But that afternoon in the Hall of Concord, I could not look away from the old soldier in the third chair of the foreign rank. And I will tell you why, though it shames me a little to admit how long it took me to see it. My name does not matter much. I was 26 that year, the most junior attaché in the Office of Foreign Receptions, and my whole task that day was to hold a folder of seating cards and to look as though I belonged among people far above me. The Hall of Concord is the longest room in the Ardmore Palace, 100 paces of polished gray stone under a vaulted ceiling painted with the old treaties, and on the day the Treaty of the Three Rivers reached its 50th year, it was filled wall to wall with the great and the careful. Ministers in black, envoys in their own colors. The Chancellor of our house at the high table, and across from him the delegation of Vale, our oldest ally, the nation that had stood beside the old kingdom of Ardmore in the war our grandfathers fought. And in the third chair of the Vale rank sat a man so old he looked carved from candle wax. I noticed him first because he did not fit. The rest of the Vale delegation were sleek modern men, attachés and ministers in pressed suits, the sort who check a watch without seeming to. But the old man wore a uniform out of a museum, a long gray coat with a high collar, a single faded ribbon at the breast, white gloves gone soft and ivory with age. He sat very straight, the way men of a certain making always sit, hands folded on the silver head of a cane, and his eyes were the pale, washed blue of someone who has looked at distances his whole life. A steward beside me murmured his name and title under his breath, the way we are trained to, so I would not be caught blank if anyone asked. Colonel of Honor of the Vale Republic, last living officer of the river crossing that had saved both nations in the war. The guest of honor, in fact. The whole 50th anniversary was built around the treaty he had helped sign as a young lieutenant, 50 years before, in a tent by a flooded ford. The guest of honor, and not one of his own people, was looking at him. That is the thing I want you to understand before I tell you the rest, because everything that mattered turned on it. The hall was full of people who had crossed a continent to honor what that old man had done, and the old man himself sat alone in a crowd, while the very delegation that had brought him bent their heads together over papers and schedules and quiet, urgent business, the way busy men do when the ceremony is long and the real work is in the corridors afterward. I watched a younger Vale officer lean past the colonel's shoulder to whisper to someone, using the old man's space like furniture. The colonel did not seem to mind. He only folded his gloved hands a little tighter on his cane and kept his pale eyes forward, toward the dais, where the speeches had begun. And the speeches, I should tell you, were endless. The Treaty of the Three Rivers is a long document, and the men who admire it are longer still. The Chancellor spoke. Then a minister spoke about what the Chancellor had said. Then the senior Vale envoy rose to answer, and a translator rose beside him to say it all again in our tongue, and the great gilded clock at the end of the hall ground forward through the better part of 2 hours, while 600 people stood and sat, and stood again in the heavy ceremonial air. It was very warm. I remember that clearly now, though at the time I hardly marked it. The Hall of Concord has no windows that open. The heat of 600 bodies and 1,000 candles and the late spring sun on the high stone gathered under that painted ceiling and pressed down on all of us, and the ceremonial dress made it worse. The heavy coats, the high collars, the gloves. I was sweating under my own folder, and I was 26 and strong. I did not think about what 2 hours of standing in stale heat does to a man who is 90 years old. But one man in that hall thought about it. He was not at the high table. He was not among the envoys or the ministers or the careful black-coated men. He stood where the men who actually hold a palace together always stand, at the edge, against the wall, in the long line of the KingsGuard who flanked the Hall of Concord that day in their full ceremonial order. Red tunics, tall black bearskins, white gloves at the seam of the trouser, polished medals, ceremonial rifles grounded at the heel, chin straps tight. a dozen of them down each long wall, motionless, eyes forward, the living frame of the whole occasion. We are taught to think of them as part of the room, the way you think of the columns, furniture that breathes. I had walked past men like that 1,000 times, and never once wondered what was behind their eyes. The one nearest the veil rank was a tall guardsman of perhaps 40, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that does not look like effort because the effort has long since become the man. I learned his name later. I will give it to you now so you do not have to wait for it. Sergeant Corwin Hale, of the KingsGuard, 11 years on the ceremonial establishment, and longer than that in the line regiments before. That afternoon he was simply the nearest red coat to the old foreign soldier, 3 paces off the colonel's right shoulder and slightly behind, and his eyes were forward like all the others. But his eyes were not like all the others. I would swear to that now. The other guards looked at the middle distance, at the discipline of the moment. Sergeant Hale's gaze, though it never seemed to move, had found the old man in the gray coat, and held there, the way a watchman's gaze holds on the one thing in a room that is not right yet but soon will be. I did not know that then. I only saw it afterward in memory, the way you see the first small crack once the wall has already come down. The thing that started it was so quiet that I, 3 feet closer than the guard and looking straight at it, missed it entirely. The colonel's gloved hand slid, very slightly, on the silver head of his cane. It was nothing, a man shifting his grip, but it was not nothing because the hand did not settle again the way a man resettles a grip. It pressed down. The knuckles, even through the soft old leather, stood up white, and the old soldier, who had sat straight as a flagstaff through 2 hours of speeches, leaned by the smallest degree forward over the cane, as a man does when the room has begun, gently and without permission, to turn. He made no sound, he drew no eye. The senior Vale envoy was still speaking at the dais, and the great clock was still grinding, and 600 people were still arranged in their solemn ranks, and the guest of honor of the entire afternoon was quietly, invisibly, beginning to go. And I, holding my folder of seating cards, did not understand what I was seeing. But the red coat 3 paces off his shoulder already had. I felt the change in him before I understood it, the way you feel a draft before you find the open door. Sergeant Hale had not moved. Not a finger, not a foot, not the line of his jaw. By any measure a watching minister would have made, he was exactly as he had been for 2 hours, a statue in red and black against the gray stone, but something in him had gathered. The stillness had stopped being rest and become readiness. I have tried many times since to say exactly what I saw, and the closest I can come is this. A man asleep and a man holding perfectly still look the same until the moment one of them is needed, and then you understand that one of them was never asleep at all. The colonel leaned a degree further forward. His pale eyes, which had been fixed on the dais, lost their focus. They did not close. They simply stopped looking at anything, the way a window stops being a window when the light behind it fails. I should have called out. I tell myself that now. I was the nearest man of the host house who had a voice to use, and the proper thing, the trained thing, was to summon a steward, signal the physician's post by the side door, do something. But I was 26 and frozen in the way the young freeze, which is not from cowardice but from the terrible certainty that to act is to make a scene, and that to make a scene at the Treaty of the 3 Rivers in front of 600 of the most important people in 2 nations was a thing one did not survive. So I stood there. I am not proud of it. I have spent years not being proud of it. The old man's own people did nothing because his own people did not see. The younger Vale officer at his left was bent over a folder, marking something with a silver pencil. The minister beyond him was watching the dais with the fixed patient face of a man counting the minutes to luncheon. The whole sleek modern delegation that had carried this old soldier across a continent to be honored had, in the long grinding heat of the 2nd hour, simply forgotten he was there. He was the reason for the day, and he had become the least watched man in the hall. And then he began to fall. It was not a dramatic fall. That is what undid the few who later swore they saw it coming. There was nothing to see coming. The colonel did not cry out or clutch his chest or topple. He simply, slowly, like a tall thing on soft ground, started to go sideways off the right edge of his chair, his gloved hand sliding at last off the silver cane, the cane beginning its own slow tip toward the polished floor where, in that hushed hall, its fall would have rung like a dropped sword. I want you to hold in your mind how this would have gone if the man at the wall had been what I always thought such men were. The cane would have struck the stone. The crack would have turned 600 heads. The old soldier would have folded out of his chair and onto the floor of the Hall of Concord, in his museum coat with his one faded ribbon, in front of the cameras of 2 nations, in front of the chancellor and the envoys and the painted treaties. The guest of honor, the last man of the river crossing, crumpled like a forgotten coat at a coronation. There would have been a gasp, then a scramble, then a circle of horrified faces and lifted phones, and the 50th anniversary of the Treaty of the 3 Rivers would forever after be the day the old hero collapsed, and no one caught him. That is the day that did not happen, and the reason it did not happen took one step. Sergeant Hale came off the wall. I have replayed that step 1,000 times because it was, in its way, the most disciplined thing I have ever watched a man do, and almost no one in that hall saw it at all. He did not lunge. He did not break into the kind of rush that turns heads. He took one long, level, unhurried step out of the line and across the 3 paces of open floor, his rifle coming up off its heel, and into the crook of his left arm in the same motion, out of the way, controlled, never clattering, and he arrived at the old man's right side precisely as the old man arrived at the edge of the world. And then he simply caught him. Not with a grab, not with the wild snatch of a man saving something. He set his white-gloved hand flat against the old soldier's shoulder and upper back, firm as a doorframe, and he let the falling weight come into that hand and stop, the way you stop a slow door so it does not slam, taking the speed out of it gently, absorbing it, turning a fall into a lean. With his other arm he reached across and his gloved fingers closed on the silver cane an inch above the floor, plucked it out of the air, and set it soundlessly upright against the chair. It made no noise. That was the genius of it, though genius is a strange word for a thing done by instinct and training in less than 2 seconds. There was no crack of a cane, no scrape of a chair, no cry. To the 600 faces turned toward the dais, nothing at all had happened. The senior Vale envoy went on speaking. The clock went on grinding. And against the long gray wall, a KingsGuard now stood half a pace forward of his place, one hand flat on an old man's back, holding the entire weight of a hero so quietly that the man beside the hero had not yet looked up from his folder. I was close enough to hear what came next, and I will carry it the rest of my life. The old colonel's eyes came back. The light returned behind the window. He felt the hand on his back and the chair under him and the cane somehow upright again, and for a moment the confusion of a man surfacing from deep water moved across his face. And then, slowly, the old discipline reassembled itself, the spine straightened by a degree, the chin came level, and the colonel of honor of the Vale Republic understood that he had been about to fall in front of 2 nations, and had not. He turned his head, the smallest amount, toward the red coat at his shoulder. And Sergeant Hale, without turning his own head, without breaking the line of his eyes, said 4 words, so low that only the old man and I could have heard them. "I have you, sir." The colonel's throat worked. His own gloved hand, the soft ivory glove of a uniform 50 years older than the one beside it, came up and pressed, just for an instant, against the back of the white glove on his shoulder. One old soldier's hand on a younger soldier's hand. A whole language passing between them in that touch, a language I was too young to read then, and have spent my life learning since. Then the colonel faced front again, straight as a flagstaff, and the Hall of Concord did not know that anything at all had occurred. But it was not over. It was, in fact, only the harder part beginning, because a man who has nearly fainted does not simply stop being a man who is nearly fainting, and the speeches were not done, and the old soldier could no more sit unaided through another hour than he could fly. The hand on his back could not stay there forever without being seen. And the guest of honor still needed to get out of that hall on his own 2 feet, with his dignity whole, in front of the people who had crossed a continent to honor him and had, every one of them, failed to watch him fall. What Sergeant Hale did over the next quarter hour I have described to younger officers many times when they ask me what discipline actually means, because it is the clearest answer I know. People imagine discipline as standing still and saying nothing. They are half right. The harder half is knowing which still moment to break, and breaking only that one, and breaking it so quietly that the world keeps turning around the place where you moved. He did not call for help. To call for help was to make the scene the old man feared more than falling, the circle of faces, the lifted phones, the murmur running down the ranks. The veil hero, he had to be carried out. Hale understood that. I am certain he understood it in the first half-second, the way he understood everything that day, because the choice he made was not the easy choice and not the safe choice but the one right choice, and a man does not stumble onto the one right choice by luck. He kept his hand where it was, flat and steady against the colonel's back, but he eased forward another half-step and turned his own body a degree, so that to anyone glancing down the rank, he was simply a guardsman standing very close to his post, and the bulk of his red shoulder now screened the old man from the side of the hall where the cameras sat. He made himself a wall. Not a wall to keep the old soldier in, but a wall to keep the staring world out. A patch of shadow and stillness in which one tired man could be tired without the whole of 2 nations watching him be it. Then he did the thing I have never forgotten. Without moving his lips more than a breath, eyes still forward, he began, very quietly, to talk. "There is water coming, sir. Look to the dais and breathe slow. Count the breaths if it helps. The envoy has perhaps 10 minutes left, and then there is a hymn, and during the hymn everyone stands and turns to the high window, and I will have you on your feet and turned with them, and no man in this hall will know you were ever anything but the straightest soldier in it." The colonel breathed. I watched his chest under the old gray coat go from the shallow flutter of a man at the edge to the slow, deliberate fill of a man given something to do with his fear. That I have since learned is the whole of it. A frightened man drowns in the gap between the danger and his own helplessness, and the kindest, most disciplined thing one human can hand another is a task. Hale had handed him counting. Breathe slow. Count. Look to the dais. 10 minutes. The old soldier took the orders the way old soldiers do, with gratitude disguised as obedience, and the color came back into his waxen face by the smallest degree. The water came. Here is how it came, and here is where I finally stopped being furniture. Hale's eyes, without his head moving at all, found mine. I do not know what he saw in my face, terror probably, and the beginning of shame, but he found me, the one hosthouse man within reach who had a voice and 2 free hands, and he gave me the smallest movement of his chin toward the side door where the stewards kept the carafes, and the medical post sat behind its discreet curtain. It was an order. It did not feel like one. It felt like a door opening in a wall I had thought was solid, like being told, "You are not helpless. You only thought you were. Here is the thing you can do." I went. I have never moved so gladly in my life. I crossed to the side curtain with the smooth, unhurried walk we are drilled in for exactly such moments, murmured 3 words to the steward there, and came back along the wall with a single glass of water and a folded cloth, carried low against my folder, so that to any watcher I was merely an attaché fetching something tedious for the high table. I will tell you that those 40 paces, there and back, did more to make a man of me than the 4 years of training that came before them. I had thought my whole life that the important people were the ones at the high table. I learned in those 40 paces that the important person was the one against the wall in the red coat, and that I had been standing 3 feet from him for 2 hours and had taken him for a column. Hale took the glass from me without seeming to. The exchange folded into the angle of his body where his shoulder screened the old man, and he held it to the colonel's lips himself, tipping it slow, a swallow at a time, his white glove steady as the cane he had caught. The cloth he pressed once, cool, against the back of the old man's neck under the high collar, where the heat pools and where a faint man can be brought back from the edge by nothing more than that. He did all of it in the small private space of his own body's shadow, and the senior Vale envoy droned on, and not one of the colonel's own delegation turned their heads. That is the detail I cannot let go of even now. Through all of it, the catch, the cane, the water, the cloth, the men who had brought the old soldier across a continent to be honored never once looked at him. The younger officer marked his folder. The minister counted the minutes. The day was about the old man, and the old man had become invisible to the very people who owed him the day. And it took a stranger in a red coat, a man whose entire profession is to be looked through, to be the one person in 600 who actually saw him. The envoy finished. There was the ripple of applause that runs through a tired hall when it senses the end approaching. And then, exactly as Hale had promised, the master of ceremonies rose and announced the hymn of the 3 rivers, and 600 people came to their feet and turned, as the old custom demands, toward the great high window at the eastern end, where the spring light came through in long bars of gold. Everyone stood, everyone turned. And Sergeant Hale, in the cover of that great shifting of bodies and skirts and the rising swell of the hymn, brought the old colonel of honor of the Vale Republic to his feet. He did it as if he were doing nothing. One hand moved to the old man's elbow, the other stayed flat at his back, and he lifted, not pulled, lifted, taking the whole of the weight a frail man cannot find in his own legs and feeding it back to him so gradually that by the time the colonel was upright he seemed, to any eye, to have risen on his own. The cane went into the old soldier's gloved hand. Hale's body stayed half a pace behind and to the side, close enough to be a railing, far enough to be invisible, and there, in the gold light of the high window, with the hymn rising around him and a KingsGuard standing like a shadow at his shoulder, the last living officer of the river crossing stood straight and sang. His voice was a thread, but it was there and it was steady, and the man beside him had given it back to him. I was weeping by then, quietly, into my folder of seating cards, and I was not the only one, though the few of us who wept did not yet fully understand what we were weeping for. We thought it was the hymn. It was not the hymn. But the day was not done with us, because when the hymn ended and the recession began and 600 people started the long murmuring shuffle toward the great doors, the old soldier had to walk, the length of that 100-pace hall, past the high table, past the cameras, past his own indifferent delegation, out under the painted treaties and into the light. And a man who could not stand through a speech cannot walk 100 paces. Sergeant Hale had one move left, and it was the one that broke the Hall of Concord open at last. You have to understand the protocol to understand the size of what he did. A King's Guard on ceremonial establishment does not leave his post during a recession. He holds the wall until the hall is cleared and the order to stand down is given. The recession is the most watched passage of the whole afternoon. It is when the cameras run longest, when the great and careful file past one another and bow and are seen to bow, when every man in a red coat is precisely where the eye expects a red coat to be. To step out of that line in the middle of the recession was to do the one thing his whole training forbade, the one thing that would be noticed, the one thing that could not be hidden. He did it anyway. The recession began at the high table, as it always does, the chancellor and the senior envoy leading the slow procession toward the great doors. The Vale delegation rose to take their place in the line, the younger officer, the minister, the sleek modern men, and they moved off toward the doors in their order of precedence, talking already of the luncheon, and not one of them stopped for the old man in the third chair who had not yet found his feet. I watched the colonel's delegation walk away from him. I watched them leave their guest of honor behind, the way you leave an umbrella, and begin to flow with the crowd toward the doors 100 paces off. And I saw the old soldier understand it, saw the flicker of a very old, very practiced loneliness cross his face, the loneliness of a man who has outlived his usefulness to the people around him and knows it and has made his peace with it, and was about to face the long, bright hall alone, on legs that would not carry him, in front of everyone. That is when Sergeant Hale left the wall. He stepped out of the line of the King's Guard, fully, openly, in the middle of the recession, in front of the cameras and the Chancellor and the 600, and he came around to the old colonel's right side, and he offered him his arm. Not his hand, his arm. The crook of his red sleeve held out and steady, the way a son offers his arm to his father, the way an honor guard escorts the one man in the room who has earned an escort. He stood there in his full ceremonial order, bearskin and medals and white gloves, half a head taller than the bent old soldier, and he waited out of position, out of protocol, exposed to every eye for the colonel to take his arm. For a moment the old man only looked at it. I think he could not at first understand that it was being offered to him. He had spent the day being looked through, to be suddenly, deliberately seen and not pitied, not hurried, not managed, but offered an arm with the grave courtesy one soldier shows another, was almost more than the old discipline could hold. His pale eyes filled. His chin trembled once and steadied. Then the colonel of honor of the Vale Republic laid his soft ivory glove on the red sleeve of a King's Guard he had never met, and rose, and the two of them began to walk. In the hall of Concord saw. I cannot tell you exactly how it spread, only that it spread the way light spreads when a curtain is drawn back, all at once, everywhere. A minister near the doors stopped. Then the man beside him. The slow river of the recession which moves only forward began, impossibly, to still. Heads turned, not in alarm now but in something quieter and far larger, as 600 of the great and careful watched a tall guardsman in red walk the length of the hall of Concord at the pace of a 90-year-old man, not hurrying him, not steering him, only being there, an arm and a wall and a quiet voice, so that the last living officer of the river crossing could cross his own treaty's anniversary on his own feet, with his head up. They walked past the high table. The Chancellor, who had reached the doors, turned back to see what had stilled his hall, and when he saw it, the Chancellor of the House of Ardmore, a man I had watched bow to no one all afternoon, stopped where he stood and waited, and inclined his head as the old soldier and the guardsman drew level with him. It was not in any program. No master of ceremonies had arranged it. The Chancellor bowed to the old man because the room had, in that moment, remembered what the day was actually about, and the head of our house would not let the guest of honor pass without the honor. And then the rest of them began to do it too. It moved down the hall ahead of the two walking men like a wind through wheat. The ministers in black inclined their heads, the envoys in their colors. The careful men who had counted the minutes to luncheon now stood still and bowed, one after another, as the old colonel passed. And the old colonel, who had been about to be carried out a forgotten coat, walked the full 100 paces of the hall of Concord through a slow falling wave of bowed heads, on the arm of a King's Guard, while the gold light came down from the high window and lay across the both of them. His own delegation, near the doors, turned at last. The younger officer with the silver pencil saw, and the color drained from his face, and I watched the man understand in one terrible instant exactly what he had failed to do all afternoon, that the honor he had been too busy to give had been given instead by a stranger, in front of two nations, and that everyone now knew it. He did not bow so much as flinch into a bow. I did not feel sorry for him. I have tried over the years to feel sorry for him, because the heat was real and the day was long and the failure was an ordinary human one. But I think of the old man's loneliness in the third chair, and the sorrow will not come. They reached the great doors. The old soldier stopped there in the threshold, with the spring light of the courtyard ahead of him and the bowed hall behind, and he turned slowly on Sergeant Hale's arm to face the guardsmen. I was close enough again to hear. I had followed them the whole length of the hall, my folder forgotten against my chest, and I was not the only one. Half the foreign service had drifted in their wake without quite meaning to. The colonel looked up at the tall man in red for a long moment, and then he let go of the arm, and he stood on his own, steadier now, the water and the rest and the dignity having done their work, and he drew himself up to the full of his 90-year-old height, and he raised his soft ivory glove to the brim of his old gray cap, and he saluted the King's Guard. A colonel of honor saluting a sergeant. It is not done. It is backward. Rank does not salute down. But it was the only language the old soldier had large enough for what he meant, and he gave it, his hand trembling at the brim, his pale eyes streaming and unashamed. And Sergeant Hale, who had broken his post and his protocol and every rule of the recession to walk that old man home, Sergeant Hale came to attention, rifle at his side, and returned the salute. Crisp, full, perfect. The salute of a young soldier to an old one, of the present to the past, of a man who has read the whole history of someone in the cut of an ancient coat and the weight of a single faded ribbon, and decided, without being told, that this man would not fall today. The Hall of Concord, 600 strong, stood in silence and watched two soldiers salute each other across 50 years and 2 nations, and one quiet act of mercy. And I understood, finally, what I had been weeping for. It was not the hymn, and it was not even the old man's near fall and rescue, though both moved me. It was the seeing. In a hall built to honor a hero, 600 important people had managed not to see him, until one man whose whole trained purpose was to be unseen had looked and seen and acted, and in doing so had taught the entire room how to look. That is the thing the red coats are for, I think, though it took me until that afternoon to learn it. We mistake them for decoration. They are the opposite of decoration. They are the men who watch the part of the room no one else is watching. The old colonel was helped out into the spring light by his own delegation, who could not now do enough for him, who pressed water and chairs and apologies upon him in the courtyard with the desperate energy of people who have been caught. He bore it graciously. He was a soldier. He knew the difference between care and penance, and he took both with the same level courtesy. But before they bore him off, he asked, in his thread of a voice, for one thing, and the one thing he asked for was the name of the guardsman. That is how I came to know it, and how I came to write it down. Sergeant Corwin Hale, King's Guard. I made certain it was recorded. I have made certain of it every year since. There was a small reckoning afterward, of the kind there always is. Sergeant Hale had, after all, left his post during a recession in plain view of 2 nations, and there is always some careful officer ready to call the right thing irregular. I was junior and frightened still, but I had found a little of my voice that day, and I used it. I gave my account plainly to the duty officer and then to a board of exactly what I had seen. A guest of honor about to collapse, ignored by his own staff, caught and sustained and walked to safety by a guardsman who had judged, correctly and in less than 2 seconds, that the dignity of an old ally mattered more that day than the dignity of a marching line. The board did not reprimand him. I am told the marshal of the King's Guard, when the matter reached him, read the account through once and asked a single question, whether the old soldier had fallen. He was told the old soldier had not fallen, had in fact walked out under his own colors with his head up. The marshal is said to have closed the file and remarked that the post exists to guard what is precious in the house, and that an honored ally of 50 years' standing was precious in the house, and that a guardsman who understood that had not left his post, he had finally been at it. The matter required no further action. The colonel of honor of the Vale Republic died the following winter, full of years. The last man of the river crossing gone at last. I learned of it from a quiet notice, and I learned something else with it, which is why I am able to finish this story the way it deserves to be finished. Among the old soldier's few possessions, set aside by his own instruction to be sent across the border after his death, was a single thing meant for a man he had met only once. His faded campaign ribbon, the one from the river crossing, the only decoration he had worn on the museum coat that afternoon. It came to the KingsGuard with a card in an old man's careful hand, and the card said only this: "For the one who saw me, wear it for me. A soldier of the river." I do not know whether Sergeant Hale ever wore it. He is not the sort of man who would tell me, and I am not the sort of man who would ask. But I know it reached him, because I carried it the last of the way myself, up the long gray hall of Concord where it had all happened, to the wall where the red coats stand, and I put it into his white-gloved hand, and for one moment the stillness in him gathered the way it had gathered that afternoon, and his jaw worked once, and he said, very low, "Thank you. I have him." The same 4 words very nearly that he had given the old man in the hall. "I have you, sir. I have him." I do not think he meant them as an echo. I think they are simply the words that live in a man like that, the deepest thing he knows, that what is precious is not to be let fall, and that the holding of it is a duty that does not end when the music stops or the cameras go dark, or the man you are holding has gone on ahead of you into the light. I am old myself now, older than I ever thought I would be, and I have stood through a great many ceremonies since that one. I watch them differently now. I do not watch the high table. I watch the walls. I watch the line of red coats no one else is watching, and I think of a long warm afternoon and an old soldier in a museum coat sliding quietly off the edge of the world, and the one man in 600 who stepped out of the line to catch him. Not for the cameras, not for a record, not for thanks, but because that is what the post is for, and because the most honorable thing a strong man can do is to make sure the old and the tired and the overlooked are not let fall. I never forgot the old ally, no one was watching. But more than that, I never again made the mistake of thinking the men against the wall were furniture. They are the ones who are watching. They have always been the ones who are watching. And if you are ever in a great hall and you are weary and you feel yourself begin to go, look to the wall. Look to the red coat that is too still to be asleep. He has already seen you. He has you. He has had you all along.